Thank you so much for those beautiful and kind words. I really greatly appreciate it. And though I know I'm not deserving, and I try very much not to take it to heart because I feel that if I do, my head becomes bigger and I have to buy larger kippas. But it's definitely something to aspire to. And I hope that yet to achieve it. So thank you so much. The book that HaKadosh Baruch Hu privileged me to put out, Musings of a Millionaire, is a book that is built, in my opinion, on two major foundations. Number one, I fully believe that davening in a minyan in a shul is and remains the highest epitome of davening and praying as a Jew. There is nothing higher than being within a quorum of a minyan in a synagogue. You're in the right place and you're with the right group of people in order to pray, to open your heart, and to get closer to God, and hopefully God answers everything you ask for. But the second foundation is that when you enter a shul, and this is not rare, and I don't believe it's unique in my experience, when you enter a shul, you see things that seem to be at odds with that first foundation. In place of it being an elevating experience, an inspirational experience, it seems at times that people are there, yet they're only there because of the obligation, not expecting to be inspired too much by what's around them, by what they hear, and more importantly, by the prayer service that's happening. And I'll give a few examples in order to illustrate what I mean. Number one, it's seldom that people walk into synagogues empty-handed. There are prayer books in the synagogue, there's Sidurim. However, people seem to be walking in to shuls with a lot of reading material because they expect that the experience they're going to have there is going to be a rather boring one. And in order for them to get through it, they need reading material in order to make it interesting. The reading material will be interesting, but the prayer service in and of itself won't be. And from this perspective, they come in with a lot of reading material that has nothing to do with the prayer service per se. Number two, it's not rare that in a synagogue there's much talking. Now, take that experience and equate it to what happens at home. If indeed you can't be in a synagogue, you can't go to shul, and you have to pray at home. I don't see many people in the middle of their prayer service begin to talk to their wives and kids. But in shul, it happens. And yes, you're seeing people you usually don't see at home, so obviously you want to extend salutations and see how they're doing. But there is always time after the services. And I'll be honest with you, if you're in the middle of a very, very good movie, be it in a theater or at home, I don't believe that if someone walks in, you're going to allow the movie to continue to run and at the same time speak to this gentleman or lady. What you probably do is pause the movie and then speak to them and then continue. But if you're in a cinema, I don't believe that the movie's going to end and ultimately you're going to go ahead and continue to speak to someone while the movie's happening. Yet in synagogue, prayer service happens, people speak. So they come in with reading materials, number one. Number two, they speak a lot, and I'll be honest, if they don't speak, they could be on their phones texting or returning emails. They could be running out to get a phone call. And yet, this is the epitome of Ula ovdo bechol levavchem, and you shall serve God with all your heart. And yet what's happening is, despite it being that, people seem to opt for other things. Number three, it's also not rare in a synagogue to have a wonderful cantor, chazan, get up and lead the services, and yet many people don't daven along. Many people don't pray along with him, don't close their eyes in devotion and start shuckling, which is a word only in Yiddish and there's no translation. But quite frankly, you don't see that happening simply because they're not inspired by that cantor, by that chazan. And therefore they stand, they don't interrupt, albeit it doesn't look like they're inspired. They're not closing their eyes in devotion. Now equate that experience to what happens at a wedding, or the kumsitz, or the tish. Any of the above. Anything that happens outside the prayer service. People are rather inspired. They're sitting there with their eyes closed, they're singing along, or they're dancing up a storm at a wedding. You don't see that happening necessarily at the prayer service. And yet the prayer service is the epitome of us serving God with all our heart, according to the Rambam, based on the Talmud. And you don't see that happening in a synagogue. You see that happening at a wedding. You see it happening at a kumzitz tish, but not in a synagogue. So first and foremost, they walk in with reading materials to try to not be too bothered, quote unquote, by the prayer service. Secondly, they do other activities that are above and beyond prayer while they're there, from texting on their phones to talking to people. And number three, even when there is an actual service happening, they're not necessarily as inspired, at the very least, or even worse, not inspired at all, like they are at a wedding or at any other gathering above and beyond the prayer service. Number four, there's a lot of dead time. A lot of dead time in services that I believe doesn't need to be there. I'm sure you've been there, that the laning, which is a Torah reading, which can take about 15 minutes to read if you divide it up to 7 aliyahs on Shabbos, 8 to be precise, or 6 aliyahs on Yom Kippur, takes almost twice the time because of what we call the Mishaberachs. There's a lot of dead time when a chazan repeats words above and beyond what he's supposed to. And again, if all these things above actually inspired people, I could sit here tonight and try to build the halachic validity to say it. But I'm not so sure that's happening, because I look around at those times and I see people either roll their eyes or stand there dying to sit down, or going ahead and again reading or texting. It doesn't seem that that dead time is time for people to reflect, to gather their thoughts, and then to go to the next part of the prayer service. But rather, it's basically, as I said, dead time. And I can go on with many, many examples. But the bottom line is, there is two foundations that should not be counter to one another. Two foundations that should work together. Number one, the basic, I would say, not theory, but I would say the basic foundation of Judaism, that minyan is the highest epitome of Jewish prayer. And doing so in a synagogue is the best and most elevated place in order to do it. And yet at the same time, if that was true, then people should be inspired and elevated, and they should be doing nothing but praying. And yet, that's not what's happening in a typical synagogue. And I described many of the things that happen, the phenomenons that we meet every time we walk in to a synagogue. And just to sum up what I said until now, if you missed the services, say on a Shabbos or on a Yontif, and either your husband or wife, your spouse, or someone from your family actually went to shul and they came home, the question usually isn't, how is davening today? The question usually is, how is the sermon? Who did you see? But like davening per se, which is the real reason you should be there, is not necessarily the question you're going to ask. And therefore, I would like a situation where these two foundations are not counter to one another, but work together. These two foundations, that this is the highest epitome of Jewish prayer, and therefore when you go into synagogue, you should be ultra inspired, far more than a wedding, far more than a kumzitz. How can they work together? And therefore, as a minyaner, as someone that ultimately goes to minyan 3 times a day, if he's able, I tried to write this book from that perspective, believing fully in the amazing power of Jewish prayer, especially in a minyan in a synagogue, and at the same time trying to take off the various excuses. Trying to take off all the things that I believe are counter to attaining that. And therefore, going through the table of contents of the book, here are the things that I dealt with. Number one, when should davening begin and end? We have a situation where we're saying many, many parts of the prayer service that do not require a quorum of a minyan. Those parts I suggested could be said privately, either at home or in the synagogue, before the communal service begins. So there's Birkot HaShachar in the morning, the blessings of the morning, there's Korbanot, there's Psukei de Zimra, all the above, up until the Kaddish after Yishtabach, or for the Chazan, the Yishtabach with the Kaddish. All of the above could be said privately, and part of it at home. It doesn't necessarily need to be said in the synagogue, which prolongs the service. And if that's the situation at the beginning, it's also the situation at the end. Namely, we do not need a situation where at the end of the services, we need to say, Aleinu and Shir Shel Yom and En Kelokeinu at certain times of the year. We even add LeDavid Hashem Ori and Anim Zmirot with Kaddishes in between. All of the above does not necessarily need to be said in a minyan. Number 2, reducing recitals of the mourner's Kaddish. Our services are not only saturated with many people, unfortunately, who are in the year of mourning or are commemorating Yortzites, but it's heavily saturated with many, many Kaddishes. And I'm not so sure all of them are needed. They're needed both for the service as well as for the mourner. And I don't belittle for a moment the power of that Kaddish for both in this world and in the next. But I don't believe that the quantity we have today is necessary, not to mention that throughout the generations, many a rabbi has come along and said too many of Kaddishes is not necessarily a very positive thing. Number 3, the chiyuv to be chazan. The chiyuv means someone in the year of mourning who preferably should be chazan on the weekdays. Does every person that has that chiyuv, that has that obligation, indeed get first rights of refusal to be chazan? Is that true even if he's a terrible chazan? Either he doesn't know how to pronounce the words, or he knows how to pronounce the words, but he doesn't really have a voice, or he has the voice, he can pronounce the words, but he's too slow, or he's too fast. In those situations, do we still say, no, he has to be the chazan? Or perhaps the price we pay is too high. Number 4, melodies. Melodies can make and break a synagogue. Literally. Melodies can uplift people or bring down people. And how do you choose melodies that people will sing along and say, wow, I was inspired, I just hope that God listened? Versus how do you choose melodies that may be classical, people maybe know it, but they're so bored by it. And as I said earlier, at weddings or at other solemn gatherings, they're very inspired, but yet in synagogue, in the services, they're not. Next, repeating words which we alluded to earlier, which I find very unnecessary unless it enhances the davening. And most of the time when words are repeated, it doesn't necessarily enhance the davening. Practicing to be a chazan, which is very important. You're never going to be a good chazan and a leader of services unless you practice. But I don't believe you take a child, or someone that's never been chazan for that matter, older, and say, try out with Shachris on Shabbos. You start out at a basic level, Ma'ariv during the week, and you build up to Mincha, and you build up to Shachris, and then you build up to a Shabbos and a holiday, and eventually you'll be a wonderful professional chazan. The Mishaberach. The Mishaberach definitely gives a lot of honor to the people who get aliyahs. On the other hand, it takes a lot of time. And the question I have is it necessary? Do we need so many Mishaberachs in a service? The sermon. The sermon is definitely part of the service, even though it's Torah learning, it has nothing to do with prayer. But quite frankly, since it's there and it brings people into synagogue, where should it be? And I personally find it very problematic that the sermon has to be sort of a divider between Shachris and Musaf. I believe that Torah learning is only internalized if people want to be there, not if people are forced to be there. And therefore, to say, okay, you're coming to daven, and you want to daven in a minyan, and there's Shachris and there's Musaf. So we're going to put the sermon split right in the middle, so you're forced to hear it. I believe that is not necessarily a good idea. And I suggested in the book where the sermon could be. where on the one hand, the rabbi or the person giving the sermon can of course deliver it, albeit it doesn't necessarily need to be smack in the middle of the service as a divider. Or to be more precise, I don't want the Torah to be sort of something that people say, go, we have to get this over with. But rather it should be something people's hearts and minds are open to, willingly, and not forcingly. Finally, I deal with the phenomenon of learning Torah during davening, writing during davening, and many other things people do during davening. First, on a halachic level, is it permissible? And second of all, even if it's permissible, what are we doing wrong that people are not just holding a prayer book in their hand, they're actually writing, or they're doing other things like learning Torah? I believe all these ideas are the basic phenomenons that you find in almost any synagogue today. And if we begin to deal with them, perhaps eliminate some of them, perhaps refurbish some of them, perhaps fine-tune some of them, and perhaps even decide we're going to leave them. But we'll think about them. I believe our services can be all the more better. First and foremost, for the people coming in. There will be less and less excuses why they don't enjoy what they see. Second of all, I am sure they'll be far more inspired. Thirdly, if they're far more inspired, hopefully they'll daven better. And the goal of why we're coming to synagogue will hopefully be attained. We're not just there for us to feel good. We're there for us to get to the highest degree of prayer so that God above listens and hopefully grants us all that we need. That's only going to happen if we mean what we say. And we're only going to mean what we say if we're inspired to do so. And we're only going to be inspired to do so if these many, many phenomenons are either eliminated or fine-tuned. And I believe that if we do that, God willing, we'll not only have synagogues that are functional, but we'll have synagogues that people not only come to, but come to on time and leave on time. Come to and are inspired, and most importantly, come to and would like to come back. Thank you all so very much. And God willing, I hope and pray that we'll be able to pray together for many more years in health and in happiness, not just because we're obligated to, but because we feel privileged and inspired to. All the very best, and have a good night.